everyone, welcome back to my channel for a brand new mystery with Mollie. If you are new around here, if you've never seen my face on your screen before, then hi, my name is Mollie and I post true crime videos like this every single week. So if you think that that is something that you might want to stick around for, then please do subscribe and don't forget to switch on the little notification bell so that YouTube will let you know whenever I post a new video. This week we are going to be talking about the solved case of Tonya McKinley, a young mother of one who went out on New Year's Eve in 1984 and never returned home. For Tonya McKinley, 1985 would barely even begin, as in the early hours of the morning on New Year's Day, she was found murdered. The police immediately began the hunt for the killer, but due to a lack of suspects and the limitations in forensic science, they just couldn't identify the perpetrator until more than 3.5 decades after this horrific crime, when finally the police had the breakthrough that they so desperately needed, and they finally found the man who killed Tonya all those years ago. But quickly before we get into the case, please listen carefully to the following. This video is about the murder of a young woman, and it involves heavy themes such as violence towards women, rape and sexual assault, and also suicide. Viewer discretion is advised. So for this week's case, we are going back, coming up to 38 years now, to late 1984 or early 1985 even, given the fact that this case took place on New Year's. And our case today takes place in Pensacola, which is a city located in the state of Florida in the US. And this is Tonya McKinley. She was a 23-year-old woman who lived in Pensacola. Tonya was born on the 25th of January 1961. Her mother was named Laverne, her father was named Joe, and Tonya was one of 2 children. She had a sister named Renee. And Tonya and her family were originally from a city called Milton in Florida. That's where she and Renee grew up. And it appears as though Tonya had a nice, good childhood. Her sister Renee said that they would often spend time together going to the movies, they would go skating, they would go bowling a lot, just fun activities like that. Tonya was described by those that knew her as almost being fearless. She was not afraid of anything, and she just had this big bundle of energy about her. She was said to just have such a huge personality. She was very funny, always cracking jokes and making people laugh. She was one of those people that was just kind of naturally the center of attention. I don't think she necessarily sought out to be the center of attention. It was just that her personality drew people in and caught their eye. So she always had a lot of friends growing up. She found it very easy to chat to people, it seems. After leaving high school in her later teenage years, that was when Tonya decided to move from Milton to Pensacola, which is about 24 miles away, so not too far. And she and her best friend Vanita, who also just happened to be her cousin, they decided to move there together because they just both loved the area. And you know, they were getting older, entering adulthood, so this was an exciting new chapter for them both. Career-wise, Tonya had aspirations to work in the medical industry. She wanted to basically work as a transcriber for doctors, so she started putting in the work for that. She began taking transcription classes upon moving to Pensacola. And it was also, I believe, shortly after moving to Pensacola when Tonya would meet a man who would ultimately become very significant in her life. She met a man named Tim Davidson, and very quickly Tonya grew a liking to Tim, and Tim felt the same. And so they started seeing each other. They got into a relationship and they moved in together relatively quickly, apparently. It appeared to be a kind of whirlwind romance. However, it was quite a turbulent one as well. You see, a lot of people in Tonya's life didn't actually think that her and Tim were a very good match, just because they were so similar in their personalities. You know that saying, opposites attract? Well, Tim and Tonya were not the opposite of each other at all. As I said, they had so many similarities, which I think caused them to clash quite a lot. Tonya's best friend Vanita said that they were very alike in the sense that they were both strong-willed and hard-headed. I think they were both very opinionated, so this caused a lot of arguments between them, and they were very much on again, off again. One minute they seemed to be so happy together, the next they were arguing and splitting up, and then they would get back together again. There was that little connection between them that would always bring them back to each other every single time. And then, I believe rather unexpectedly, in the early 80s, Tonya discovered that she was pregnant with Tim's child. So despite despite their rocky relationship, they were going to be parents. They were going to have to raise a child together. And in the summer of 1983, Tim and Tonya welcomed their son into the world, and they decided to name him after his father. He was called Timothy Davidson Jr., and Tonya seemed to absolutely thrive in motherhood. She absolutely adored that little boy with every fibre of her being. She doted on her son. She was so caring and loving towards him, and she knew that she would do anything for him. She would do whatever it took to provide the best life for him, and it appears as though that included separating from her partner, Timothy Jr.'s father, for good. I think Tim and Tonya tried to make the relationship work for well over a year after their son was born, but it just wasn't working. They were still arguing a lot, and so by late 1984, Tonya had decided that she didn't want to be with Tim anymore, and she broke up with him. And so she took her son, and I believe they moved in with Tonya's best friend Venita and her partner and kids for the time being. It must have been a scary time for Tonya, being a newly single mum to Timothy Jr., who by the time she moved out was around 17 to 18 months old. But I mean, she was a strong woman, and as nerve-wracking as it might have been, she was probably also looking at it as a fresh start, a new chapter of her life, although it was a chapter that would barely even begin, because not long after splitting up with her partner Tim and moving in with her best friend, 23-year-old Tonya McKinley was actually found dead. It was the 31st of December 1984, so obviously New Year's Eve, and Tonya decided that she was going to go out with her best friend Venita that night. Obviously, being a newish mum, Tonya never really got to go out much anymore. She rarely got to go out and let her hair down, but tonight she decided that she was going to. She was going to go out and have some fun and celebrate the new year. So Tonya took her son Timothy Jr. to a daycare centre, I think, as did Venita. She dropped her kids off there too. And then they went off to a bar in Pensacola called Daryl's Bar. They were having a couple of drinks, probably having a dance on the dance floor. Tonya was chatting to many of the people in the bar because she actually knew a lot of them. As I mentioned earlier, she was a very chatty person who always made a lot of friends, many of whom were in the bar that evening. So she was enjoying catching up with them. She seemed to be having a really nice evening. At midnight, they did the New Year's countdown. They drank champagne to celebrate the beginning of 1985. And then shortly after midnight, Tonya's best friend Venita decided that she was going to leave and go and pick up her kids from the daycare centre, because apparently the daycare closed at around 1 a.m, so they had to go and collect them relatively soon. However, Tonya decided that she didn't want to leave yet. As I said, she was having a lot of fun. This was such a rare night out for her that she didn't want it to end yet. And so she basically asked Venita if she wouldn't mind also picking up her son, Timothy Jr., from the daycare and then taking him home with her, because they obviously lived together, and that way Tonya could stay out a bit longer. And Venita said, yeah, that was fine, but she asked Tonya, well, how are you going to get home then? Who's going to take you home? And apparently Tonya said something along the lines of, oh, don't worry about it. I know so many people here. I'm sure I'll be able to find a lift. And so with that, Venita left to collect her children and Timothy Jr., leaving Tonya in the bar to enjoy the rest of the night. But little did Venita know when she left that that would actually be the last time she would ever see her best friend again, because Tonya never returned home. The following morning, Venita and her partner woke up, they got out of bed, and they quickly realised that there was no sign of Tonya. She wasn't home. Although I don't think they really panicked too much initially. They didn't really think too much into it at first, but that all changed when later that morning there was a knock at the door. It was Venita's partner's mother, and she had arrived to deliver the news to Venita that Tonya had just been found dead. Earlier that same morning at around 3 a.m. on the 1st of January 1985, a family who lived on Peacock Drive in Pensacola got in their car and they were on their way to the emergency vet because their dog wasn't very well and he or she needed immediate medical attention. So they started their car, pulled off the driveway, and as they did that, the young daughter of this family noticed something, an object on the grassy curb on the side of the road. She pointed it out to her parents and said that it looked like a mannequin. However, her mother quickly realised that no, that was not a mannequin that her daughter had seen. It it was the dead body of a young woman, and so the police were called. And it didn't take long for the police to identify this woman. After taking her fingerprints and checking them against their databases, she was identified as, of course, being 23-year-old Tonya McKinley. Tonya's fingerprints were actually on police records because apparently she had been arrested a couple of years earlier in 1981 for a drug-related offence. So yeah, it didn't take long for the police to work out who the deceased was. When Tonya was found on the side of the road, she was kind of partially clothed. She was wearing a blue dress that I believe she had been wearing to the bar that evening to celebrate New Year's. But from what I can gather, her shoes, her heels, weren't on her feet. They were discovered on the ground near her body, I think. Next to her body, the police discovered this blue towel, which was dirty and blood-stained. It looked like it had traces of blood on it. So of course it was very obvious to the police when they arrived at the scene that Tonya had most likely been murdered. Just the way in which her body had been left. I mean, she'd just been ditched on the side of the road. That made it clear that this was probably no natural death, and her autopsy later confirmed this. It was found that Tonya had been both strangled but also hit over the head. She'd been hit with some kind of heavy object, so this was a brutal murder. Now, upon closer examination of the crime scene on Peacock Drive, the police quickly determined that Tonya was probably killed elsewhere and then her body was brought to this location, because when she was found they noticed that her blue dress was very dirty and I think disheveled, which suggested that perhaps there had been a struggle with her attacker, although there were no signs of a struggle on the side of the road where she was discovered. So yeah, it seemed as though the murder took place somewhere else and then she was brought to this area where she was just dumped. And as well as her other injuries, it was also found that Tonya had most likely been sexually assaulted by her killer, because traces of semen were detected when a rape kit was performed during her autopsy. So they had the DNA of the offender, but I'm sure you guys probably already know what I'm about to say. Due to the fact that this was the mid-80s, the police couldn't really do much with this evidence at the time due to the limitations of DNA and forensic technology. It was in its infancy. All they could really do at this point with this semen evidence was determine the killer's blood type, and they found that he was type A, but like I said, that was it. That was all that they could establish at this point. But luckily, the evidence didn't stop there. Also retrieved from both Tonya's body and also that blue blood-stained towel next to her body was some hairs. They found pubic hairs, head hairs which were a brown colour, and also black animal hairs, it seems. So this potentially gave the police a clue. Perhaps the killer had a dog. So all of this evidence was collected and the investigation officially launched into the murder of Tonya McKinley. The police began trying to find the man that had taken her life that night, and it didn't take them long at all to identify their first person of interest. It was obviously Tonya's ex-partner and the father of her child, Tim Davidson. Upon speaking to Tonya's loved ones and her friends, they learned that Tonya and Tim had obviously only split up very recently, and they also learned that this breakup was far from amicable, because it wasn't like the feeling was mutual. They didn't both decide that breaking up would be the best option. It was Tonya that ultimately called it off, and apparently Tim wasn't very happy about this. He didn't want to be apart from Tonya, and according to a documentary that I watched about this case, after they split, Tim would follow Tonya quite often. He was always checking up on her. So yeah, he did become a pretty solid suspect for the detective. They started thinking, did he perhaps confront Tonya on the night of New Year's? Maybe he followed her to the bar or after she left the bar or something. They got into a heated argument because he still wanted to be with her, and this argument ended in him killing her. Was this a case of, if I can't have you, then no one can? Tim denied it. He denied any involvement in Tonya's death, and so the police asked him if he would be willing to provide some samples of his hair so that they could compare his hair to the hairs that were found on Tonya's body and on the blue towel. And he did. He was more than happy to give over these samples. However, when they were examined, they were found not to be a match. It was not his hair that had been collected as evidence, which indicated decided that Tim was telling the truth. He was innocent. So the police continued looking into other men in Tonya's life. They also spent a lot of time extensively looking into the people that were in the same bar as Tonya on the night that she was killed, Daryl's bar in Pensacola. They thought that maybe she left with someone from the bar and that someone was the person who went on to kill her. And there was one person from the bar in particular that the police took an interest in. It was actually the bartender, and his name was Kurt. And the reason he became a person of interest was because apparently Tonya and Kurt were kind of seeing each other at the time of her death. Well, they were described as having a very casual relationship, so I don't think they were, like, you know, committed to each other. They were just having fun, enjoying each other's company. And he was working in the bar on the night that Tonya was in there. So the police spoke to Kurt. They asked what he did on the night that Tonya was killed after his shift at the bar ended. And he apparently said that he had gone to a New Year's party with his roommate and a couple of other people. Although apparently there were some issues with his alibi in that there was a gap of time from that night where he was unaccounted for, where no one could confirm where he definitely was. So it seemed as though he may have potentially had opportunity to carry out this crime, carry out Tonya's murder. Kurt was asked by the police to undergo a polygraph test, which apparently came back with inconsistencies. It was inconclusive. So that made the police a tad more suspicious of Kurt, I think. However, they were able to eventually rule him out as being the killer when his blood sample was taken. It was found that he did not have the same blood group as the murderer. He did not have blood type A. So the investigation continued. The police carried on trying to identify other potential suspects. But I mean, apart from Tim and Kurt, they couldn't find anyone else really. And now those two had both been eliminated. And tragically, this meant that as time went by, as the weeks and the months went by, the case started to go cold. And it remained that way for a long time. It remained cold and unsolved for literally years and years. And it must have been absolutely agonizing for Tonya's family, not knowing who took her away from them, not seeing that person face justice. It must have been awful for her son, little Timothy Jr., to grow up without a mum. As we know, Timothy was only 18 months old when Tonya was killed, so he probably had no memory of her whatsoever because some evil person decided to take her life. Although Timothy actually had no idea what happened to his mum growing up, I think it was decided by his father, Tim Sr., and the rest of the family that it was probably best that Timothy didn't know the full truth about what happened to his mum. He was obviously told that she had passed away when he was just a baby, but when he would ask how she died, he was informed that it was as a result of a tragic car accident that she was involved in. Although I say when he asked, but actually Timothy said in a documentary that he never really asked about his mum that often throughout his childhood because he could just tell that whenever he did bring her up, it was very uncomfortable to discuss for, you know, his father and other family members. He didn't necessarily know why at that point, but he could just tell that it was very, very painful for them, and he didn't want that. He didn't want to upset anyone, so yeah, he wouldn't mention her very often, and for all he knew, she died in a car crash, or at least that was until he was in his early teenage years, because that was when he finally found out what really happened, the true circumstances surrounding his mother's death. You see, when he was around like 14, 15 years old, Timothy was kind of hunting around his dad's closet because it was coming up to Christmas, and I think he wanted to try and find out what his dad had got him. He was being a little bit cheeky and he wanted to find out what presents he was getting that year. So he was going through his dad's closet searching for presents, but instead he found a letter that his father had written, and it was addressed to American television host Montel Williams. He had his own talk show which was literally called The Montel Williams Show, and this letter was basically Tim Davidson pleading with Montel Williams to, I think, help him spread awareness of his ex-partner and the mother of his child's unsolved murder case. I think Tim thought that perhaps if Montel Williams spoke about Tonya's case on his show, then maybe that would generate some new tips and leads for the police to look into, because obviously by this point it had been well over a decade since Tonya's death, and there were no developments. It was still cold. And it was through reading this letter that Timothy Jr. discovered that his mum didn't die in a car accident after all. She had actually been murdered, which is awful. It's not a nice way for him to find out what happened to his mum. Not that there is a nice way to find something like that out, but you know what I mean. I'm sure he probably would have preferred his father to sit him down and tell him face to face, but at the same time, of course, Timothy understood why they'd kept the truth from him all his life. He understood that that probably was what was best for him growing up. And I don't know if his dad, Tim Sr., actually ever sent that letter to Montel Williams, if anything ever came of that, but whether he did or not, the case remained unsolved. Now, around the early 2000s, Tonya's case was revisited because it was thought that perhaps the advancements in DNA and forensic technology, which had come a long way since Tonya's death, that maybe they would help to finally crack the case and find the killer. So the police got all of the evidence related to Tonya's case out of storage and they sent it off for testing. And this obviously included that blue bloody towel that was found beside her body. And luckily, scientists were able to extract what they believed to be the killer's DNA from sections of this towel. And they developed a DNA profile, which was then entered onto the CODIS database, although unfortunately at the time, no match came back. But you know, this was something. This was a big development in the case regardless. At least they had the offender's DNA profile and hopefully, eventually, a match would flag up. But sadly, following this, the case again stood at a bit of a standstill for a long time. Her family was still waiting for answers. Her family would often reach out to the Pensacola Police Department for updates, but they never really had any to give, to be completely honest. But in 2015, there was another glimmer of hope in the case. Obviously, 2015 would have been the 30-year anniversary of Tonya's death, and that was when the detectives decided to go down the route of familial DNA testing. So as I just mentioned, they had previously entered the killer's DNA profile into the CODIS database and no match came back. But in 2015, they thought, okay, we haven't found the killer on the CODIS system, but maybe instead we could search it for potential relatives of the killer. Perhaps a family member's DNA will be on the database, and obviously their DNA will be very similar to that of the perpetrators. And so they started doing that. They started searching CODIS for a familial link. And they did eventually find one person on there that may have had a familial link. And so they started looking further into this family. They even got in touch with all of the family members of this individual on CODIS and asked for their DNA samples to be compared against that of Tonya's killer. And the family was said to be very cooperative. They were more than willing to help the police and give their DNA samples. However, it was upon doing all of this when scientists determined that actually there were no matches. There wasn't actually a familial connection to the murderer within this family, which, as you can imagine, was really disappointing for the investigators. They thought that finally, after 30 years, they were on the right track. They were finally close to identifying the perpetrator, but this just led nowhere. It was a dead end, unfortunately. A couple of years after this, in 2018, a news reporter named Tony Adame became involved in the case. Now, he didn't actually report on crime, I don't believe. He usually reported on sports. However, he was very interested in true crime and cold cases. And at one point, he read about the unsolved case of Tonya McKinley on the internet. He actually came across a kind of Facebook memorial page for Tonya, which had been created by her sister Renee. He read up on her case, learned that it was unsolved and that it had been unsolved for well over 3 decades by this point, and he decided that he wanted to help. He wanted to try and help this poor family finally get the answers as to who killed their beloved Tonya. Of course, he was a reporter, he was no detective, but you know, it had been that long since Tonya's death that I think he probably just thought the more people looking into her case, the better, regardless of their experience in solving crimes, I suppose. Tony just wanted to offer his time and help, and so he reached out to the Pensacola Police Department and he asked if it would be possible for him to go over Tonya's old case files, which I think the police were understandably a bit hesitant to allow him to do at first. They were kind of like, what would this reporter want with her case file? However, upon actually meeting with Tony, they quickly realized that he genuinely did just want to help. He genuinely wanted to dedicate a huge chunk of his time to help solving this case once and for all. And yeah, they just got a good gut feeling from Tony, I think. And so the detective working on Tanya's case, Detective Chuck Mallet, he decided to do something that is never, or very rarely done at least. He agreed to let Tony delve into the case file of Tonya McKinley. And Tony kind of joined the team who were investigating Tanya's case. And I can imagine that it probably was really helpful to have him on board, because although he didn't necessarily have experience in criminal investigations, as a journalist, he did have experience in like digging out old reports and going through them and speaking to people. So he was a good asset to have in that sense, and they had a good team put together. The year following this, in the spring of 2019, the team of new detectives and obviously Tony, they decided to try a new technique as part of their search for Tanya's killer, and that was genetic genealogy. They were going to search through genealogy websites. So this was kind of similar to the previous DNA technique that they had used in 2015, the familial DNA testing. However, as we know, back in 2015, they used familial DNA testing to try and find a relative of the killer in the CODIS database, whereas in 2019, they thought, why don't we expand our search? Because clearly there were no relatives of the killer in CODIS, but maybe they might be able to find a relative through genetic genealogy websites such as Ancestry and GEDmatch. So they got started on that, and eventually they got a hit. They found what they believed was a third or fourth cousin of the offender. So they were starting out with a pretty distant relative. So now the team had the enormous task of trying to build a family tree around this relative and kind of dwindling it down until they found an individual that perhaps could have been the perpetrator. So they were obviously specifically looking into the males in this family who would have been around at the time of Tanya's murder, who lived either in or around Pensacola at the time, who perhaps lived very close to the crime scene or the bar where Tanya was last seen. And as I said, this was an absolutely huge task. It was going to take a long time, but eventually in February of 2020, the team identified a man within this family who they believed may have been their guy. It was a man named Daniel Wells. He was 57 years old by this time, which would have meant that at the time of Tanya's murder in the mid-80s, he would have been around the same age as Tanya, like 22, 23. He had a job as a woodworker, he had a family, he was a father. He had had a couple of brushes with the law in the past. Apparently just a couple of years after Tanya was killed in the late 80s, he was arrested for battery and witness tampering, according to one source. And then according to another source, in the late 90s, he was arrested in the state of Missouri, which is where he was living at the time, and he was arrested for indecent exposure. Although from what I can gather, he was never actually like formally charged for any of these offences, hence why his DNA wouldn't have been entered into the CODIS database. And upon looking further into Daniel Wells, the detectives discovered that he lived in Pensacola at the time of Tanya's murder. And I believe by 2020, he was back there. He was living there again. So because of this and because of the familial DNA match, Daniel Wells became a very viable suspect for investigators. But they needed evidence to prove it. Obviously, a familial DNA link isn't enough to arrest him. They needed a definitive match to the DNA of Tanya's killer. And for this, they obviously needed Daniel's DNA. Now, the police didn't want to just go ahead and ask him for his DNA sample because, as I said, they couldn't arrest him. And if he realised that he was now a suspect in the murder of Tonya McKinley and he was the killer, then upon asking for his DNA sample, he might go into panic mode and try to make a run for it, try to flee. So instead, the detectives were like, we're going to have to try and secretly get a sample of his DNA to compare against the DNA profile of the killer. And so they put Daniel Wells under surveillance, and one day in March of 2020, the surveillance team was secretly following him as he was driving to his place of work, and as they did so, they actually noticed that he flicked a cigarette butt out of his car window. So they quickly pulled over, they collected this cigarette butt off the road, and it was immediately sent to the lab for testing because obviously it would have had Daniel Wells's saliva on it. And when his DNA was compared to that of Tonya McKinley's murderer, what do you know? It was a match. An exact match. Daniel Wells was in fact the perpetrator. After all these years, about 3.5 decades, the police finally knew who took her life, and they now had enough evidence to move in and arrest him. I believe it was the same day that the DNA match was made when Wells was apprehended. He was again followed whilst he was driving, and he was pulled over by the police, and initially they pretended as though they were just pulling him over as part of a kind of routine traffic stop so that he didn't really get his guard up or anything, until the detectives who were investigating Tonya's case arrived at the scene, and they told Daniel Wells that he would be coming with them to the police station. And they didn't really tell him why, they just said that they would talk about it when they arrived at the station. They kind of wanted to make him sweat, I think, make him panic, and I'm sure he was at this point. I'm sure he was very, very nervous. So he was taken to the police station, he was sat down, and the interview began, and they started asking him questions about the murder of Tonya McKinley. And initially, he completely denied it. He denied being her killer. He denied having ever even seen Tonya before. They showed him a picture of her, and he said, no, I have no idea who that is. Even when they revealed to Daniel Wells that they had evidence, concrete DNA evidence linking him directly to her death, he was adamant that no, he had nothing to do with it. And he tried to maintain this for a while, but eventually he clearly realized that he couldn't keep up with this deceit, and it was very clear that he was starting to panic, he was starting to crack. I think he ultimately realised that there was no point in trying to maintain his innocence. How could he deny it when his DNA was found to be an exact match to the killer's? He couldn't. There is no explaining that away. I mean, he did try to explain it away. I think if I recall, at one point in his interview, he tried to say, oh, my DNA would have been on her body because I probably slept with her on New Year's, but he still denied murdering her. But of course, the police didn't believe that, and they told him that, and so he eventually confessed to killing Tonya too. He finally admitted to the police that he was the one responsible for the death of Tonya McKinley those 35 years ago. Daniel Wells admitted to the detectives that on New Year's Eve of 1984, going into 1985, he was at the Darrell's Bar in Pensacola, and that was when he encountered 23-year-old Tonya McKinley, and I believe he said that that was the first time that they met at the bar that night. They got chatting, and Tonya apparently told Daniel that she was looking for a lift home because obviously her best friend Vanita had left shortly after midnight to go and pick up their kids from the daycare, and so I believe he offered her a lift, but upon leaving the bar, Daniel said that he didn't actually drop Tonya straight home. Instead, they went back to his house and they carried on the New Year's celebrations. They had a couple of drinks. It seemed as though they were having a good time. Now, I believe Daniel tried to claim that he and Tonya had consensual sex that night. Whether it was actually consensual though, who knows? I think it's very likely that it may not have been. But he said that they'd slept together, they'd had some drinks, and then he claimed that at some point an argument broke out between them. And he said that he couldn't really recall exactly what this argument was about, but it soon escalated and he turned violent. Daniel said that he grabbed this wooden heavy cutting board, like a chopping board, and he hit Tonya over the head with it, and he said that he hit her so hard that she died. Now, we know from Tonya's autopsy that she was also strangled by the killer, but I don't actually know what Daniel told the police about the strangulation in his interview. I couldn't find that anywhere, so I don't know if he actually admitted to strangling her. I mean, it's clear from his interview that he was really trying to minimize what he had done, make out like it was almost an accident, that he didn't mean to kill her, he didn't mean for the blow to the head to kill her, but he said that upon realizing that she was dead, he just panicked and he put her body into his truck. He drove her to Peacock Drive in Pensacola in the middle of the night, and there he just left her on the side of the road road and then he drove off. He even said in his interview that he had essentially dumped her as if she was a bag of trash. He dumped her alongside that bloody blue towel that I'm guessing he had used to wipe up the blood in his house or something. And when Daniel was asked about the black animal hairs that had been found both on this towel and on Tonya's body, he told the police that they would have come from his roommate's dog. His roommate had a black Labrador at the time. Following his confession, 57-year-old Daniel Wells was formally arrested and charged with both the murder and sexual battery of Tonya McKinley. And the detectives could finally contact Tonya's loved ones and let them know the news that they had been waiting to hear for so long, that Tonya's killer had finally been apprehended, which, as you can imagine, was so emotional for the family to hear, especially for her son Timothy Jr. Obviously, he was only 18 months old when his mother was killed, but by the time Daniel Wells was identified as her murderer, he was in like his mid to late 30s, which is crazy. And Timothy literally just broke down when the detective told him that an arrest had been made. As did the detective. He also got very emotional because all of the hours and effort that he and his team had put in to try and solve this case had paid off, and he was about to finally get justice for Tonya and her family, or at least everyone thought that they were finally going to get some justice for Tonya. Her killer, Daniel Wells, had other plans. In April of 2020, just over 2 weeks after Wells was arrested and charged, he was found dead in his jail cell, and it was eventually established that he had taken his own life. He knew that this was it for him. He'd confessed. There was no getting out of this now. He knew that after going to trial, he would be sentenced to life in prison, and he didn't want that. He didn't want to spend the rest of his life behind bars, and so he decided to just end it, kill himself, which understandably was so upsetting for Tonya's family. They felt angry that finally, after all these years, they had the answer and they were looking forward to seeing her killer get sent down for good, and then less than 2 weeks later, he took his own life. They felt like they had been cheated. They felt like it was so unfair. But sadly, that is how it unfolded. That is how the case ended. And as disappointing as it was that they never got to see Daniel Wells be sentenced to life, I'm sure that it still meant a hell of a lot to them that they did finally learn the truth as to what happened to Tonya. It's just bittersweet though, isn't it? That they finally got the answer, but they never really got the justice, or at least not in the way that they wanted it. But that concludes this case. That is the tragic case of Tonya McKinley, which took more than 35 years for the police to solve. As always, please do let me know your thoughts and opinions on the case down below in the comments. I would love to hear what you guys have to say, and also feel free to let me know of any other cases that you would like to see me cover on this channel. Again, you can let me know in the comments, or alternatively, I do have a case request form linked down below in the description box. Thank you all so much for watching. Please do give this video a thumbs up and subscribe if you haven't already, and I will see you again next year for another mystery with Mollie. This is my final video of 2023, so I just want to say a huge thank you to everyone who has been watching my videos this year, everyone who has supported my channel. It honestly does mean so much, so thank you, and I will see you again very soon for another video. Bye.